Hey guys, tonight we step into a place where survival has less to do with swords and battles and far more to do with how convincingly you can bow without fainting. You're entering the Palace of the Dark Queens, women whose courts were glittering, dangerous, and absolutely exhausting. The stone halls echo with footsteps, and every one of those echoes seems to ask, "Are you sure you belong here?" Spoiler, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Drop that in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the grand gates of the palace, heavy wood reinforced with iron and carved with twisting vines that look almost alive in the moonlight. Guards in stiff uniforms shift their weight, eyeing you with suspicion. The first rule of survival hits you immediately. You don't just walk into the court of a queen. You are measured, weighed, and quietly judged before your first step lands on the polished stone. One guard sniffs, another scribbles your name in a ledger that feels longer than a CVS receipt. By the time you're waved through, you already feel like you've sat an exam you didn't study for. The palace itself seems alive. Tapestries hang like silent judges, whispering tales of past victories and reminding you that others before you have walked these same halls. Some prospered, most faded into rumor. And here's a solid historical fact. In the courts of Renaissance queens, particularly Catherine de' Medici in France, entire teams of secretaries documented who entered, who left, and how they bowed. It wasn't just ceremonial, it was surveillance disguised as courtesy. You shuffle forward, taking in the scents. Beeswax candles, something floral but faintly sour, and the ever-present smell of too many people living in one stone labyrinth. To your left, a servant hurries past with a tray of wine that sloshes dangerously close to your sleeve. You wonder if it's poisoned, and honestly, at this court, the odds aren't zero. As you reach the inner courtyard, the noise swells. Musicians practicing, noble women rustling in skirts heavy enough to double as tents, and the clack of shoes on marble. One quirky tidbit here. Some European courts employed professional noise testers who would walk the halls before events to check the acoustics, making sure whispers couldn't accidentally be overheard. Imagine being paid to eavesdrop on silence. But back to you. You're standing awkwardly, trying not to gape at the statues. Each one is stern, glaring down as if deciding whether you deserve to breathe in their presence. A court usher approaches, unimpressed with your posture. He mutters instructions at lightning speed. No eye contact unless invited, no speaking before spoken to, and under no circumstances are you to sneeze during introductions. Which is unfortunate because the incense wafting from the chapel corner is already tickling your nose. Historians still argue whether the so-called Dark Queens were genuinely tyrannical or simply women boxed into ruthless roles by the politics of their time. Catherine de' Medici, Mary Tudor, and others like them lived in a world where softness was equated with weakness, and every decision was scrutinized by men waiting for them to slip. But from where you're standing, none of that matters. You just need to keep your knees from knocking audibly. Inside the Great Hall, the ceiling vaults impossibly high. Candles drip wax onto iron chandeliers and drafts whisper through unseen cracks. A herald steps forward and clears his throat. Your name is announced, stretched into an absurd, operatic version of itself. You try a bow, not too low, that would look desperate, not too shallow, that would look arrogant. You aim for something in between and almost topple forward, smooth. The queen's eyes flicker over you for half a second, and that's it. Your fate may already be sealed. As you're led away, you pass a table piled with gifts brought by other petitioners, a silver reliquary, a clock shaped like a lion, even what looks suspiciously like a jar of crocodile dung. Yes, really, ancient beauty regimens often included bizarre ingredients, and Catherine de' Medici's contemporaries were known to experiment with concoctions that range from powdered pearls to, yes, animal waste. You make a mental note to avoid borrowing anyone's face cream here. By the time you reach your assigned quarters, a drafty chamber with a bed that feels like sleeping on a wooden board, you realize the hardest part hasn't even begun. Survival here is less about physical endurance and more about navigating a maze of etiquette, suspicion, and the occasional poisoned pear. You crawl under stiff covers, wondering if tomorrow will be any kinder. Probably not. The torches outside gutter low, and in the echoing corridors beyond your chamber, the court murmurs on into the night. You close your eyes, pretending sleep will come easily. But the truth is, the palace never truly sleeps, and neither perhaps will you. You wake at dawn to a muffled knock, the kind that sounds polite but insists you get up immediately. A servant slips in, carrying something that looks like a dead bird draped in velvet. No, wait, this is your outfit. And this is where your next ordeal begins, the ceremonial dress and daily wardrobe of the Dark Queen's court. The pile on your bed isn't clothing in the modern sense. It's more like armor stitched from satin, brocade, and a touch of passive aggression. You're expected to wear layers upon layers. A linen chemise, stiff corset, padded roll around your hips, overskirt, underskirt, bodice, ruff, sleeves, and finally a headdress that feels like someone balanced a birdcage on your skull. Suddenly sweat beads along your neck, and you haven't even put the first stocking on yet. The servant, bless their weary soul, begins lacing you into the corset. It feels less like getting dressed and more like entering a wrestling match with a boa constrictor. As the laces tighten, you wonder how you're supposed to breathe, eat, or frankly, remain conscious. But here's a mainstream historical fact. In 16th century French and English courts, ladies' corsets were reinforced with whalebone or even metal, designed to mold the body into a stiff, upright silhouette. It wasn't comfort, it was discipline disguised as fashion. By the time the gown is assembled, you're swaddled like a decorative but slightly panicked mummy. And then comes the wig. This towering confection of hair is powdered, perfumed, and probably large enough to host a family of sparrows. You glance in a polished bronze mirror and can't help but think you look like a wedding cake that could topple at any second. One quirky tidbit you'd never expect. In some Renaissance courts, gowns were sewn with hidden pockets for perfumed sachets or even small pies. Yes, pies. Noble women occasionally smuggled food into their sleeves to survive long ceremonies without fainting. You eye your stiff brocade cuffs and wonder if you could wedge a granola bar in there. Probably not discreetly. As you're herded toward the dressing chamber exit, the air feels heavy with perfume, rose water, musk, and a suspicious hint of sulfur. Fashion in the Dark Queen's court isn't just for beauty, it's a silent language. Embroidery isn't decoration, but politics. A sprig of rosemary stitched into a sleeve could signal loyalty, while a cluster of violets might quietly mock someone's failed romance. You catch yourself staring at the patterns on a passing duchess's gown, realizing her sleeves are essentially subtweeting the room in needlework. The worst part? You don't get a say. Clothes are dictated by court rules stricter than any modern dress code. Historians still argue whether queens like Mary Tudor use these wardrobe regulations as genuine tools of control, or whether courtiers exaggerated their rigidity to make life sound more dramatic. Either way, you're not strolling in wearing jeans. As the morning stretches on, the corset bites, the wig itches, and the shoes pinch your toes. You shuffle down the corridor like a baby giraffe learning to walk, careful not to trip on your skirts. Imagine trying to sneak anywhere in this outfit. The rustle of fabric announces you like a parade float. Privacy here doesn't exist, not even in footsteps. And then, a moment of slapstick. Someone ahead of you attempts a low curtsy. Their gown poofs out like an overinflated parachute, knocking a candlestick straight off the table. Wax splatters across the floor, narrowly missing a carpet that probably costs more than your entire village back home. You suppress a laugh, but it bubbles up anyway. Fortunately, the cough you fake to cover it is swallowed by the hum of conversation. That's your second joke of the morning. The first was when you thought you'd ever breathe again in this corset. The walk to the Great Hall feels endless. You glance down a side corridor and spot a guard polishing his armor. For a ridiculous moment, you consider trading outfits with him. At least he gets pockets. But no, the court would eat you alive for stepping out of line. Fashion here is a uniform, and non-compliance equals rebellion. Finally, you're seated on a long bench with other newcomers. You all look like overstuffed peacocks, blinking at one another in shared misery. Someone whispers that the queen herself changes gowns 5 times a day, each one heavier than the last. That sounds extravagant, but it's true. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, was known to change her wardrobe multiple times during a single day to project power, wealth, and mood. Meanwhile, you're just trying not to faint before breakfast. And here's the cruel twist. You don't even own these clothes. They're on loan, provided by the crown or borrowed from wealthier patrons. If you spill wine on the sleeve or tear a hem, you'll owe someone enough to bankrupt your descendants. You suddenly feel as though you're wearing debt, not silk. By the time the sun is fully risen, your back aches, your ribs are pinched, and your wig feels like a very bossy cat perched on your head. You lean against the cool stone wall, pretending you're fine, but every nerve in your body is screaming. Survival in this court, you realize, isn't just about saying the right thing. It's about enduring outfits designed to make you look regal while also making you regret every decision that led you here. So when the herald finally claps his hands and announces that it's time for the morning rituals, you're not even relieved. You're already too busy wondering if you'll ever get the circulation back in your toes. The herald's clap echoes like a pistol shot, and suddenly everyone around you moves at once. Gowns swish, heels click, sleeves flutter, and you're swept into the tide of courtiers heading toward the audience chamber. This is the realm of morning rituals and courtly etiquette, the part of the day where knees do more work than brains. You shuffle forward, trying to keep your balance as your corset digs in with every step. Ahead of you, courtiers begin dropping into bows and curtsies, some so deep you wonder if they'll need a crane to get back up. And here's your first lesson. You don't just bow at the queen, you bow at the floor, at the chamberlain, at the priest's candle, at some guy holding a silver staff. By mid-morning, your spine has rehearsed enough angles to qualify for an architectural diagram, a mainstream fact. In Tudor and Valois courts, etiquette manuals were published to outline exactly how many degrees you should incline your head depending on the rank of the person you greeted. It was geometry meets politics. Bow too shallow and you're insolent. Bow too deep and you're desperate. You're mostly just dizzy. The Queen's chamber is dimly lit, shafts of light filtering through stained glass. Incense curls lazily in the air. Everyone kneels as the Dark Queen makes her entrance, gliding across the floor with the composure of someone who has been rehearsing intimidation since childhood. You copy the crowd, dropping to your knees and instantly regret it. The stone floor is freezing, your joints creak, and your wig tips forward as though trying to abandon ship. You straighten it just in time. Survival means not looking like you're molting in public. Historians still argue whether these morning rituals, the so-called lever ceremonies in France, or the public prayers in England, were meant as genuine spiritual acts or as carefully staged theater to remind everyone who held power. Either way, for you it feels less like worship and more like cardio in slow motion. Then comes the ritual of the hand kiss. One by one, courtiers shuffle forward, bending low to press lips to the Queen's fingers. You watch nervously, hoping you won't accidentally sneeze or bite. By the time it's your turn, you're trembling. You take her hand, bow, and give the gentlest brush of a kiss. Success. Well, almost. Your wig slips again, and you swear the Queen's eyes twinkle. Whether with amusement or with a mental note to exile you later, who can say? And then the rules multiply. You're instructed never to turn your back on the Queen. You must walk backward out of the chamber. Naturally, you nearly trip. A nearby noble gives you a sympathetic side-eye, the kind that says, "Welcome to the club of constant embarrassment." One quirky tidbit: at certain courts, attendants were forbidden to cross their legs while sitting in the Queen's presence. Not because it was rude exactly, but because it revealed the soles of shoes, which were considered, frankly, a bit indecent. You tuck your feet neatly under your gown just in case. The rituals drag on, hymns sung at glacial speed, endless recitations of titles and lineages. You pretend to follow along, but your mind drifts. You wonder if this is why medieval people invented embroidery, something to do with their hands while trapped in ceremonies that outlasted their patience. The hours blur together. Your knees throb, your corset gnaws at your ribs, and your neck aches from nodding at every passing noble. At one point, a duchess beside you whispers a tiny joke about the bishop's hat being taller than the candlesticks. You stifle a laugh, and the sound bursts out as a half cough, half snort. The duchess smirks. You've accidentally bonded over shared suffering. By late morning, the queen retires to her private rooms and the courtiers sag in relief. You hobble to a bench, legs trembling from too many curtsies. For a fleeting moment, you feel proud. You've survived your first set of rituals. But then you notice a steward glaring at you. Apparently, you sat down before being given permission. Strike one. The day has only just begun, and already the court has tested your endurance. Etiquette here isn't about elegance. It's about control. You're reminded at every bow, every kneel, that your body doesn't belong to you in this palace. It belongs to the theater of power. And as you rise again, summoned toward the next ordeal, you mutter under your breath that if the floor doesn't break your knees first, the endless rules will surely break your spirit. But no one hears you. Everyone is too busy bowing again. You stagger out of the ritual chamber, starving, stiff, and a little bit delirious. Just when you think the worst is over, a steward announces that it is time for the grand banquet. A chorus of groans ripples through the line of courtiers, because here in the Dark Queen's palace, banquets aren't about food, they're about endurance. The hall is prepared like a stage, trestle tables lined with embroidered cloths, silver platters gleaming under candlelight. Musicians in the corner tuning their lutes as if preparing for battle. You are ushered to a seat somewhere in the middle, low enough to be humbling, high enough to keep you in sight of the ever-watchful queen. You perch stiffly, corset biting, wig wobbling, praying nothing explodes. The food parade begins. Peacock pies, their feathers reattached for dramatic flair. Platters of roasted venison that look magnificent but smell slightly too gamey. Bowls of pottage, essentially thick porridge, that slurp like mud when stirred. A server plunks down a jug of wine so sour it could double as vinegar. Mainstream fact: royal banquets in the 16th century often stretched for 6 or more courses, with each course featuring multiple dishes. They weren't just meals, they were demonstrations of wealth and power. The queen wasn't feeding her court so much as staging a performance with you as reluctant extras. You glance around and notice something peculiar. People aren't really eating. They're nibbling delicately, making polite noises of enjoyment, but most plates remain half full. This is a survival tactic. Eating too much looks greedy, eating too little looks insulting, and enjoying yourself too obviously makes you a target. You attempt the safe nibble, which is basically chewing as though you've forgotten how jaws work. And then comes a quirky tidbit: sugar sculptures. Yes, entire edible statues of animals, castles, or saints carved from sugar paste. They look glorious, but taste like chalk. You watch a countess break off a sugar swan's wing, chew it politely, and then slip the rest into her sleeve. You consider doing the same, but your gown is already bursting at the seams. The musicians strike up a slow tune, the kind that feels like it's been going for 3 days already. Courtiers chatter in hushed tones. Someone near you mutters about the queen's temper, someone else whispers about the ambassador's accent, and you, poor, naive you, try to sip wine. It scorches your throat like a lemon gone feral. You cough discreetly, but not discreetly enough. A noble 2 seats away smirks at your suffering. Strike 2. Historians still argue whether these banquets were primarily diplomatic events or elaborate traps designed to watch courtiers squirm. Catherine de' Medici, for example, was infamous for seating rivals together just to watch the sparks fly, while Mary Tudor's feasts often doubled as tests of religious loyalty. For you, it's simply a test of bladder control, because with all this wine and no bathroom breaks, things are getting tense. Hours crawl by, trays keep arriving, lamprey pies, spiced quince, even something called blancmange that is neither white nor particularly mangy, but deeply confusing nonetheless. You're so full you feel hollow, if that makes sense. Your body has stopped registering food as sustenance. It's just another obstacle to survive. At one point, a jester tumbles into the hall, juggling apples while reciting rhymes that are only mildly funny. Still, everyone claps with exaggerated delight. You join in, half-heartedly, because in this court, laughter isn't about humor, it's about obedience. You chuckle just enough to prove you're still awake. That's joke number 2 for the day, the first being when you thought this meal would actually nourish you. The banquet lurches into its 4th hour. Servants clear away bones, feathers, and half-chewed sugar beasts. You've lost all sense of time. The hall is stuffy, heavy with the smells of meat, wax, and perfume. You begin to hallucinate that your wig is sliding off in slow motion, preparing to flop into your soup. Mercifully, it stays put. Finally, dessert arrives. Candied orange peels and almond marchpane, pretty to look at, teeth shattering to chew. You gnaw politely, jaw aching. When the queen finally rises, everyone leaps up in unison. The banquet is over, but you feel less triumphant and more like you've survived a natural disaster. You limp out of the hall, stomach leaden, throat raw from sour wine, ears ringing from endless lute solos. And here's the kicker. You're told there will be another feast tonight, because in this court, banquets aren't celebrations, they're battles, and you're losing badly. You barely have time to recover from the banquet before you're thrust into the real sport of the palace: gossip, intrigue, and the dangerous art of flattery. Food may weigh you down, but words can finish you off in seconds. The hallways buzz like a hive. Courtiers huddle in clusters, whispering into perfumed sleeves, fanning themselves dramatically, and glancing over shoulders as if every passing servant might be an informant. Which, to be fair, they probably are. You hover at the edge of one group, pretending to admire a tapestry while your ears strain to catch the conversation. You hear snatches about someone's secret dealings, someone else's unfortunate cough, and whispered so low it's practically silent, Her Majesty's mood. Here's the fact. In courts from Tudor England to Valois France, gossip wasn't entertainment, it was currency. Careers were made and destroyed on a single rumor. If someone claimed you snored too loudly in chapel, you might find yourself reassigned to the coldest corner of the palace. If someone hinted you winked at the wrong ambassador, you could be branded a traitor. It was less like high society and more like high-stakes poker played with whispers. You attempt a smile and a comment about the weather, which seems neutral enough. But no, even the weather can be politicized here. Say the harvest sun is too hot, and suddenly you're criticizing the Queen's agricultural policies. Say the rains are too heavy, and you're accused of sympathizing with the enemy's grain merchants. You retreat quickly, cheeks burning, mentally adding avoid meteorology to your list of survival tips. And then comes a quirky tidbit. Courtiers sometimes hired professional flatterers, people who would follow them around, murmuring constant compliments to boost their reputation in public. It sounds absurd, but then again, imagine how effective it would be to walk into a room with someone announcing, "My lord has never looked so radiant in this torchlight." You briefly consider whether you could get away with hiring one for yourself. Sadly, your purse is emptier than your patience. Historians still argue whether queens like Catherine de' Medici deliberately encouraged this climate of gossip to maintain control, or whether the court simply evolved into a self-sustaining rumor machine. Either way, you're trapped in it now, and you're already stumbling. At one point, a noblewoman sidles up to you, batting her fan like it's an extension of her soul. She leans in and asks what you think of the Queen's new gown. This is a trap, obviously. You fumble for a compliment that's effusive but not ridiculous. "It suits Her Majesty's dignity," you murmur. The noblewoman stares, expression unreadable, then drifts away. Congratulations. You've either passed or you've doomed yourself. You won't know which until it's too late. The day stretches on in a haze of small talk and nervous laughter. You overhear arguments about which saint is most fashionable this season, whether the new ambassador bows correctly, and which lord secretly dyes his beard. You realize quickly that no one cares about truth. What matters is spin. A scandal isn't deadly unless someone repeats it twice. And oh, how people repeat. You try to contribute a harmless anecdote about a hunting dog you once saw trip over its own ears. It's light, funny, non-political, but the chuckles you receive are thin, polite, and tinged with that awful sense of this outsider doesn't know the game yet. You sip your wine, still sour, praying the floor will swallow you. Joke number 2 of the day is realizing that in this court, even comedy has to be rehearsed. The Queen's shadow hangs over everything. No one mentions her directly, but every conversation bends toward her presence, like iron filings pulled by a magnet. You start to notice how courtiers phrase things, never saying, "she is angry," but "the stars have been unsettled lately." Not "she dislikes that countess," but "winter seems colder for some households." It's all code, and you're still fumbling for the key. By evening, you're dizzy with words. You've nodded at rumors, dodged questions, offered compliments that made your tongue ache, and still you suspect you've made 3 new enemies without realizing it. You collapse onto a bench, massaging your temples. The court isn't exhausting because of feasts or ceremonies. It's exhausting because you never stop performing. As you glance around the hall, you realize that silence here is more suspicious than speech. You can't win by staying quiet. You can't win by speaking either. The only real victory is to stay invisible, gliding just under notice, letting gossip swirl above your head like smoke while you quietly avoid choking on it, which of course is easier said than done. The sun dips low, but rest isn't on the schedule. Evening brings with it the heaviest burden of all, the eyes of the queens themselves. You thought gossip was suffocating, but the moment you step into the smaller, more intimate reception hall, you realize you've entered a fishbowl. The dark queens are perched on elevated chairs, not thrones exactly, but high enough to remind you of your station. Every flicker of their gaze feels like it pins you to the wall. This isn't paranoia, a mainstream historical fact. Catherine de' Medici, Mary Tudor, and similar monarchs often kept mental tallies of their courtiers' behavior, who looked attentive, who fidgeted, who whispered. These women didn't need to spy through secret keyholes. They turned their own presence into a weapon. If they stared long enough, you broke into a sweat, confessed your sins, and possibly reconsidered your entire career. You try to keep your expression neutral, but already your wig is sliding, your corset pinches, and your eyes are watering from the ever-present incense. Someone beside you drops into a curtsy so low you hear her joints creak. The queen's lips twitch, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. Was it approval, amusement, annoyance? Hard to tell. The ambiguity is part of the design. Here comes a quirky tidbit. Some nobles use tiny hand signals to survive these gaze-heavy encounters. A twitch of the ring finger might mean, "Don't speak," while a tap of the fan against a knee could mean, "Change the subject before you die." You notice a lady fluttering her fan oddly and wonder if she's signaling you, or if she's just battling the smoke. Either way, you do nothing. That's safest. The longer the queens sit, the more oppressive the silence becomes. A cough echoes across the chamber like a cannon shot. You shift your weight, praying your knees won't pop. And then, you catch the queen's eye. For a half second, her gaze locks with yours. You freeze, trying to project reverence, humility, and mild intelligence all at once. It's like cramming for an exam in one heartbeat. Historians still argue whether the watchful eyes of queens like Catherine were a deliberate psychological tactic or simply the natural gravity of a monarch's role. Some accounts describe them as almost omniscient, able to recall exactly who failed to bow 3 months earlier. Others suggest this was exaggeration, the court's paranoia magnifying every glance. Either way, your palms are sweating so much you could water the palace herbs with them. A noble at the far end of the room attempts humor, telling a story about a hunting accident. The queen does not laugh. Instead, she stares until the man falters and stumbles back into silence. You swallow hard. Lesson learned. Laughter here isn't for the queen's amusement. It's for her permission. Your own attempt at invisibility falters when a steward ushers you closer. The queen gestures, faint but unmistakable. She asks about your homeland, your family, your skills. You try to answer clearly but concisely, terrified of oversharing. Too many words make you suspicious. Too few make you dull. You mention that you can write neatly and keep accounts. The queen hums softly, inscrutable. Did you just volunteer to spend your life hunched over parchment until your back gives out? Possibly, but at least you're still breathing. One of the courtiers beside you shifts nervously, blurts something sycophantic about the queen's wisdom, and instantly goes too far. Her Majesty raises one eyebrow. The room tilts with tension. You nearly hold your breath until the queen waves her hand dismissively, sparing the overeager fool. For now. This is the true exhaustion of the court. Not the food, not the gossip, not even the ceremonies. It's the constant awareness that every blink, every gesture, every word is being recorded in invisible ink on the queen's mental scroll. You are never unobserved. You are never off stage. And then, almost mercifully, the queens rise. Everyone bows, curtsies, scrapes the floor with their dignity, and then collapses the second they leave the room. Shoulders slump, fans snap shut, whispers resume. The air suddenly feels breathable again. You realize you've been clenching your jaw so hard you might have cracked a molar. As you shuffle toward your chamber, you can't shake the sensation of eyes still on your back. The palace walls themselves seem to hum with memory, replaying every misstep. You try to shrug it off with a weak joke to yourself. At least you didn't sneeze on her shoes. Not yet, anyway. Your chamber door creaks open before dawn, and instead of peace, you're greeted by the low murmur of servants already bustling through the corridors. Sleep is a luxury you're not afforded here. The palace lives on an endless cycle of labor, gossip, and watchfulness. And now you're about to discover the strangest part of survival: the servants, the spies, and the downright bizarre chores that bind the whole system together. From your tiny window, you watch them scurry like ants. Torchbearers snuffing out last night's candles. Laundresses dragging baskets heavier than a warhorse. Pages running messages up staircases that twist like nightmares. And every one of them has ears sharper than a hunting hound. Here's the mainstream fact. In early modern courts, the servant class didn't just fetch food and polish shoes. They were the invisible record keepers. Queens relied on them as informants, and nobles feared them as rumor mongers. You step into the hallway adjusting your ridiculous wig and nearly trip over a boy hauling a chamber pot the size of a pumpkin. He nods politely as though carding other people's waste is simply the natural rhythm of life, which here it is. You sidestep quickly and think to yourself, so this is the glamorous heart of empire. Puddles and porcelain buckets. A quirky tidbit: some courts actually held contests to see whose urine was the purest, a reflection of diet and supposed health. Physicians claimed they could diagnose everything from melancholy to marital fidelity by peering into a golden liquid in a glass flask. You thank the stars that no one here has asked you to submit a sample yet. That would be the end of your patience, and possibly your dignity. You wander further into the service corridors and realize something unsettling. Conversations stop as you enter, only to resume once you pass. The servants know everything: who slipped a note into whose pocket, who stumbled drunk after the banquet, who cried behind the tapestry. They don't speak to you, but their glances say enough. We could ruin you if we wanted to. Historians still argue whether queens intentionally weaponized the servant network, or whether it simply evolved as gossip naturally seeped through cracks in the hierarchy. Either way, you suddenly feel like your survival depends less on impressing nobles and more on never offending the woman scrubbing your stockings. Later in the morning, you're invited, which is to say commanded, to help with menial duties. You're given a small wax tablet and told to copy down a string of symbols you don't recognize. Turns out they're ciphered letters, messages to be smuggled across the palace disguised as laundry lists. You scratch the markings carefully, praying you don't miss a curve or dot. Imagine explaining to a furious queen that you miscopied the code and accidentally declared war on Portugal. The day continues with absurd chores. One noble asks you to fan her dog while she naps. Another insists you stand guard over her embroidery hoop because people steal threads. You nod obediently, though you can't fathom a black market for half-finished daisies and silk. The strangest moment comes when a guard bursts in carrying a tray of what looks like crushed herbs, muttering about warding off the evil eye. He sprinkles it across the floor, nods seriously, and leaves. Everyone steps carefully around the green smears as if they're as dangerous as bear traps. You smile faintly. Third joke of the day: you're surviving history's most paranoid game of hopscotch. By mid-afternoon, your head is spinning. You've overheard secrets without meaning to. You've been forced to participate in a code you don't understand. And you've nearly fainted from the smell of laundry soap laced with lye. Every time you pass a servant, you wonder if they'll someday whisper your name into the queen's ear, tacking on some fabricated scandal just for fun. And yet the irony: you begin to rely on them. A laundress warns you not to sit on a particular bench. It creaks and draws attention. A page discreetly points out that your wig is lopsided before anyone else notices. A cook slides you a crust of bread, softer than anything at the banquet. You start to see them not just as spies, but as reluctant allies in the endless dance of court life. When you finally return to your chamber, exhausted, You collapse onto the bed and realize that the palace isn't run by the glittering nobles or even the queen herself. It's run by the unseen, unheard hands that keep it alive. And you're balanced precariously between their silence and their whispers. You close your eyes, shuddering at the thought. Survival here might not depend on whether the queen likes you, but whether the chambermaid decides to keep your secrets. The next morning, your bones still ache from chores you never expected to do, but there's no rest. Today you witness the darker undercurrent of palace life. Punishments. Not grand executions or bloody spectacles. That would be too messy, too obvious. Here the punishments are peculiar, subtle, and designed to humiliate you into obedience without leaving a scar. The queen enters the hall, radiating calm authority. Courtiers chatter nervously until a steward calls for silence. A trembling young man is dragged forward. His crime, whispered down the line, was speaking too loudly during vespers. Hardly a capital offense, you think. Yet here, it's enough to warrant correction. Mainstream fact: in Tudor courts, light punishments included being sent away from the queen's presence. A penalty so devastating, it could ruin your career. Access to the monarch was everything, and being banished even a few steps away meant social death. Today, you see it unfold. The young man is ordered to spend a week eating meals in the servants' quarters. Everyone gasps as if he's been sentenced to outer Siberia. But humiliation comes in many flavors. One court lady is scolded for tripping during a dance, and her penance is to wear bells on her hem for a week so everyone hears her stumble. Another noble is caught lying about owning imported silk. He must parade through the hall wearing plain wool while others snicker. You stifle a laugh and quickly cough to hide it. The irony, though, is rich. Half the people jeering him probably lied about their fabrics too. A quirky tidbit floats to your ears. In certain Renaissance courts, nobles could be punished by being forced to hold the queen's lapdog for hours. It sounds adorable until you realize those dogs were tiny heaters wrapped in fur, squirming and yapping, leaving scratches down your arms. The dog duty was so dreaded that people bribed servants to trade shifts. You glance at the yappy creature by the throne and suddenly dread hearing your name. Historians still argue whether these punishments were acts of calculated cruelty or simply playful corrections exaggerated by fearful courtiers. Some sources suggest queens like Catherine de' Medici used humor as a weapon, transforming mistakes into spectacles that reminded everyone of her dominance. Others claim courtiers themselves spread stories of bizarre penalties to inflate the queen's aura of mystery. Regardless, you realize you're one sneeze away from public humiliation. As you watch, the punishments keep piling up like awkward theater. A baron accused of boasting is forced to read aloud from a dull accounting manual, line after line of wheat shipments and tax levies, while the court pretends to listen. You nearly nod off yourself, though you're careful not to be caught. Imagine being punished with enforced boredom. Joke number 2 of the day. The ultimate torture here isn't pain, it's paperwork. And then the subtle punishments, the ones invisible to an outsider's eye. Someone is forgotten when invitations go out for a mask. Another finds their name mysteriously absent from the list of banquet seats. These omissions are worse than open scoldings. You can see the color drain from their faces as they realize they've slipped a notch in the pecking order, condemned to linger at the edges where no one notices them. Your stomach knots. One wrong word, one clumsy gesture, and you could be next. You remember your crooked wig yesterday and shiver, imagining the queen decreeing that you must wear it askew forever as a warning to others. It sounds absurd, but after watching a grown man punished with bells like a wayward cow, it doesn't seem impossible. The session ends with a flourish. A noble accused of being late to chapel must spend the day kneeling in the corridor, holding a candle taller than his head. His arms wobble as you pass him later, wax dripping steadily onto his shoes. You don't laugh this time. You just file the image away in your brain under reasons I may not last the week. As you return to your chamber, the lessons ring louder than the bells on that poor lady's skirt. Here, survival isn't just about staying in favor. It's about never being noticed at the wrong moment. A life lived between glances, careful and invisible, forever rehearsing how to avoid the queen's smile turning sharp. And you think grimly, maybe exile wouldn't be the worst fate after all. The bells of morning echo through the palace, tinny and insistent, calling everyone to assemble. You shuffle toward the great hall again, nerves rattling from yesterday's display of peculiar punishments. But today the air feels different, lighter, tinged with perfume and anticipation. And then you realize why. The court has turned its gaze toward that most treacherous battlefield: love, marriage, and romance. You think perhaps this will be easier than kneeling with a candle until your arms fall off. But almost immediately you're proven wrong. Here, flirting is practically a form of treason. One glance too long, one whisper too sweet, and you could end up on the queen's bad side, or worse, in her crosshairs. Mainstream fact: royal marriages in early modern courts were rarely about passion. They were political contracts meticulously arranged to secure alliances or consolidate power. Queens wielded the authority to approve, deny, or orchestrate these unions, and the personal feelings of the couple rarely entered the equation. For you, this means every smile across the hall feels loaded with danger. A young lady beside you sighs dreamily at a handsome page. Within seconds, 3 other ladies narrow their eyes, calculating whether this tiny spark could ignite scandal. By nightfall, you hear whispers. She lingered too long near the stairwell. It doesn't matter whether it's true. The story has already taken flight. A quirky tidbit makes its way to your ears. In some European courts, courtiers were required to swear oaths that they would not marry without royal permission. Breaking the rule could lead to annulment, fines, or, in one notorious case, being forced to wear your wedding clothes while scrubbing the palace floors. You picture yourself mopping marble tiles in lace stockings and nearly choke on your breath. Joke number 1 for the day: at least you'd finally put those embroidery patterns to practical use as a cleaning rag. Historians still argue whether queens like Elizabeth I genuinely relished controlling the romances of their courtiers, or whether the policy was born purely from political necessity. Some scholars suggest she enjoyed dangling matches like marionette strings, a performance of absolute control. Others believe she simply couldn't risk unsanctioned unions strengthening rivals. Either way, you, standing awkwardly in your too tight shoes, feel like a pawn in someone else's game of chess. By midday, a court masque begins, ostensibly a play, but everyone knows it's really a matchmaking spectacle. Dancers in embroidered costumes pair off, their gestures slow and rehearsed. You're pulled into the line, forced to bow and twirl alongside strangers. Your partner whispers nervously about dowries while your mind races. What if someone interprets this bow as a proposal? What if a glance is mistaken for infatuation? At dinner, the situation escalates. A baron to your left jokes that you look well-suited to a certain duchess, and immediately half the table freezes. The duchess blushes. You nearly choke on your pottage. Even this small jest could spiral into rumor. You excuse yourself clumsily, muttering something about needing air, but the damage might already be done. The queen herself notices everything. From her elevated chair, she surveys the hall like a hawk eyeing field mice. You suspect she knows who holds hands beneath the tablecloth, who slips away into shadowed corridors, who sends folded notes tucked into hymnals. And when she smiles faintly, you can't decide if it's amusement or threat. Later that evening, you stumble into the gardens, desperate for quiet. The moonlight makes the hedges shimmer silver. A couple whispers nearby, their words too low to catch, but the tension in their posture betrays them. You hurry away, not wanting to be mistaken as a witness, or worse, an accomplice. Here, knowledge is as dangerous as action. Joke number 2 of the day comes to mind as you picture it. Love in the Palace is less like a romance novel and more like a game of charades where the prize is exile. And then, the cruelest part, some marriages are announced without warning, arranged over supper like side dishes. One moment you're sipping wine, the next you hear that 2 courtiers have been bound together for the greater good. Their faces betray nothing, but you see the tension in their clenched jaws. Their future, rewritten over roasted venison. You return to your chamber, nerves buzzing. You think back to the laundress who kindly warned you yesterday. She told you, don't fall in love here. The walls have eyes and the queen has sharper ears. You laugh then. But now, after surviving an entire day where even a glance feels like a death sentence, you realize she wasn't joking. Love, it turns out, might be the most dangerous punishment of all. The night drags into morning with the groans of the palace stirring awake again, and this time you're nursing a headache, probably from the endless candle smoke and nerves. But in the court of the Dark Queens, even headaches come with a price. You're about to learn what passes for medicine here, a strange cocktail of leeches, charms, and things you wouldn't feed to your neighbor's cat. You sit at the edge of your narrow bed, rubbing your temples. A servant notices and scurries off, returning with a jug of something that smells like swamp water mixed with vinegar. She insists it's willowbark tea, a popular cure across Europe for pain and fevers. That part is real. The bark contains a chemical cousin to aspirin. You sip politely, trying not to gag, and wonder if it's helping or if you're just being distracted by the taste of mud. The physician arrives soon after, robes rustling like a stage curtain. He peers at you with the gravity of a man about to diagnose the fate of an empire. Without asking, he presses your pulse, peers into your eyes, and then announces you are suffering from an imbalance of humors. Of course, too much black bile, not enough phlegm. He prescribes a session with leeches. Mainstream fact: leech therapy was standard practice well into the 19th century. Queens, nobles, commoners, everyone was bled to balance their inner fluids. You, however, find yourself staring in horror at the slimy creatures wriggling in a jar. The physician plops one onto your wrist. It attaches immediately, suctioning away like a very determined raisin. You swallow hard. Joke number one: this is the worst spa day you've ever signed up for. As the leech feasts happily, the physician suggests additional remedies. He lists herbs, most of which you recognize: mint, sage, rosemary, and some you don't, like ground-up viper's flesh. That one, you pray, stays theoretical. A courtier passing by whispers that frog broth is another excellent cure for headaches. You're not sure whether to laugh or weep, but given yesterday's punishments, you nod solemnly and pretend you'll try it. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In certain courts, courtiers carried tiny plague amulets made of dried toads sewn into pouches, meant to ward off illness. You imagine dangling a toad carcass around your neck as the latest fashion statement and shake your head. Somehow you're not convinced the amphibian jewelry trend will take off. Meanwhile, healers and mystics argue endlessly about what really works. Historians still debate whether queens genuinely believed in these concoctions or whether they used them as a performance of piety and control. Some scholars argue the queens trusted their physicians deeply, while others suggest they privately scoffed at the leeches while outwardly following ritual. Either way, you're stuck as the guinea pig. By mid-morning, the headache has faded slightly. Whether from the willow bark, the leech, or sheer exhaustion, you can't say. But the treatments keep coming. A mystic woman enters the chamber, muttering incantations while shaking a bundle of herbs. She waves smoke over your head and insists it will draw out the bad air. You try to sit still but end up sneezing violently. Everyone nods approvingly, as if the sneeze confirms success. Joke number two: apparently healing here is judged by the volume of your sneeze. Later at the banquet, you overhear courtiers trading remedies like gossip. One swears by powdered pearls mixed into wine for clarity of mind. Another insists goose grease rubbed on the soles of the feet cures insomnia. Someone else recommends rubbing onions on your scalp to ward off baldness. You nearly choke on your bread as you imagine the smell. It hits you then. Survival here isn't about avoiding poison. It's about enduring the cures. By evening, your headache is gone, though you can't decide if you're actually better or if you've simply been distracted by a dozen bizarre rituals. You lie back on your bed, remembering the leech, the frog broth suggestion, and the toad amulet. You sigh and murmur to yourself, perhaps you'll just risk the headache next time. The palace doesn't pause just because your veins have been assaulted by leeches. Today you're dragged along into another ordeal, one the courtiers actually seem to enjoy. The agenda is pure entertainment. Lute songs, pageants, dances, masks, and spectacles staged to please the queen. For you, it's an endurance test in disguise. By late morning, the great hall is rearranged. Benches are lined up, candles drip wax from chandeliers, and a group of musicians tune their instruments. The squealing of viols and lutes sounds like geese arguing over breadcrumbs. You suppress a smile. Joke number one: apparently tuning is medieval for auditory punishment. Mainstream fact: court entertainment wasn't optional amusement. It was political theater. demonstrating wealth, control, and refinement. A queen's authority sparkled not just in crown jewels, but in how lavishly she staged a pageant. Refuse to attend, or worse, look bored, and you might as well pack your trunk for exile. The music begins, slow and plodding. A nobleman strums the lute with exaggerated gravity, as if every note might alter the fate of the kingdom. You clap politely, though inside you're wondering if the song has more verses than the Bible. The performance goes on and on until you start counting cobblestones in your mind just to stay awake. Then comes the mask, a theatrical performance blending allegory and costume. Courtiers dress as gods, shepherds, or allegorical virtues like patience and fortitude. Today's theme is triumph over envy. A man painted green prances about, chased by maidens in golden gowns, while someone reads a moralizing poem. The audience gasps at the symbolism, but you nearly snicker out loud. Joke number 2, envy apparently looks like an unripe cucumber in tights. Historians still argue whether audiences actually found these pageants moving or whether they politely pretended, fearing to insult the queen's taste. Some argue queens themselves grew weary of endless allegories yet insisted upon them because they reinforced power. You, sitting stiff-backed, can only conclude, boredom is compulsory. After hours of speeches, allegories, and dancing, you're marched outside for a spectacle. The courtyard has been transformed with papier-mâché dragons, banners flapping in the wind, and fire breathers coughing sparks into the air. Everyone applauds wildly as the dragon collapses in a heap, its papier scales catching fire. For a brief, chaotic moment, you fear the palace itself will ignite. Servants rush with buckets, courtiers laugh nervously, and the queen nods as if it all went exactly as planned. Evening falls and the entertainments continue. Jugglers toss knives, minstrels croon endlessly about lost love, and dancers leap until their stockings sag. You clap dutifully, hands numb, knowing that to appear tired is to insult the performers, and, by extension, the queen herself. A quirky tidbit floats around. In some courts, parrots or trained monkeys were part of pageants. They'd be taught to mimic courtiers or fetch props mid-performance. You scan the stage, half hoping a parrot swoops in to liven things up. Alas, no such luck. Just another noble reciting verses about the fleeting nature of spring. By the time supper is served, you're convinced your ears will ring forever with the strum of lutes. You eat mechanically, clapping between mouthfuls, nodding at speeches, and pretending to be uplifted. Joke number 3 comes to you. Perhaps the greatest miracle of this court is surviving an entire day without falling asleep on your plate. At last, the queen rises, signaling the end. The courtiers bow, relieved but still smiling, while you stagger back toward your chamber with aching feet and ringing ears. Entertainment, you think grimly, is just another test. Not of joy, but of stamina. And if you can endure 20 verses of lute ballads and a flaming papier-mâché dragon, perhaps you'll survive another day. You're barely awake when the bells ring again, and the day begins not with music or pageantry, but with the solemn weight of religion. The palace air feels thicker somehow, heavy with incense and expectation. Today you'll endure the long stretch of sermons, rituals, and vigils that keep the queen's image tied firmly to the heavens and keep you, the hapless courtier, half asleep on your knees. Before dawn, servants bustle about, lighting hundreds of candles in the chapel. Their wax drips and pools on the floor like frozen tears. You shuffle in with the other courtiers, your wig slightly askew, and kneel on a cushion that feels like a slab of granite. The priest's voice rises, low and steady, chanting words that echo off the vaulted ceiling. Mainstream fact: religion was inseparable from monarchy. Queens presented themselves as chosen by God, their rituals reinforcing divine legitimacy. Attending vigils wasn't just devotion, it was loyalty, a performance of faith that bolstered their rule. Skip one too many, and people would question your allegiance, or worse, your soul. The chanting continues, punctuated by smoke from the swinging censer. The incense is supposed to inspire awe, but mostly it inspires a coughing fit that you barely stifle. Around you, courtiers bow their heads, eyes half closed in reverence, or maybe exhaustion. Joke number 1. There's a fine line between spiritual enlightenment and falling asleep while kneeling. As the service stretches on, you catch sight of a side altar, where a relic rests, a bone in a gilded case, said to belong to a saint who protected the dynasty. A whisper reaches your ear. Some believe it's not a saint's bone at all, but the femur of a horse. A quirky tidbit, yet no one dares question it aloud. Faith here is less about truth and more about spectacle. Hours pass. You're asked to stand, kneel, cross yourself, repeat. The rhythm becomes hypnotic, and your knees feel like they're being slowly ground into dust. The queen glides in, resplendent in embroidered robes, her face serene. Every gesture she makes, touching the relic, bowing, clasping her hands, is studied by the court and copied in miniature. Even devotion here is performance art. Historians still argue whether these midnight vigils genuinely move participants or whether they endured them out of fear and obligation. Some suggest queens believe deeply in their sacred role. Others propose they simply leverage religion as the grandest stage set of all. Either way, you're caught in the middle, lungs full of smoke, legs numb, trying not to sneeze at the wrong moment. When the sermon finally ends, you stumble outside for air, only to be told that fasting is required today. You sigh, no supper, just more prayers. The idea is that hunger purifies the soul, but you can't help thinking it mostly sharpens the temper. Joke number 2. Nothing brings a court closer to God faster than 30 nobles complaining about empty stomachs in whispered Latin. As night deepens, the vigil resumes. Candles flicker, shadows dance on the chapel walls, and your mind drifts. You imagine the queen asleep in her chamber while you sit here, chanting psalms into the abyss. Someone beside you nods off, their head snapping forward with a thud. The priest glares and you straighten quickly, terrified of being next. Hours later, when the final hymn ends, you drag yourself back to your chamber, clothes reeking of smoke, stomach hollow, head pounding. The queen has been glorified, the dynasty reaffirmed, the rituals performed. You've discovered that losing sleep in God's name is almost as dangerous as gossiping during a banquet. You collapse on your bed, whispering half a prayer, half a plea. May tomorrow bring fewer candles and a little more breakfast. The palace stirs before sunrise, not with hymns this time, but with the clatter of hooves and shouts of stable boys. Today, the court sets out on the road, travels, hunts, and processions, all designed to project the queen's power beyond the walls. You, still weary from sleepless vigils, are herded toward the stables like livestock about to join the grand parade. Mainstream fact: royal progresses were essential for rulers. Queens toured their realms not only to be seen, but to remind subjects of their living presence. Staying visible meant loyalty, taxes, and fear all remained intact. For you, however, it means bouncing endlessly on horseback while trying not to faint from saddle sores. You mount a horse with all the grace of a sack of flour. Courtiers around you are decked out in plumes and velvet, looking like peacocks preparing for battle. The queen rides at the center, her palfrey gleaming, banners fluttering around her. Every village we pass bursts with cheering peasants, though you suspect half of them are just grateful for the free bread tossed into the crowd. As the day drags on, the hunting horns blare. You're urged into the woods where the queen herself takes up a bow. The hounds bark, the courtiers shout encouragement, and suddenly you're tearing through underbrush, praying you don't fall off. A deer darts past. The queen looses an arrow with startling precision, and the court erupts in applause. You, meanwhile, have twigs in your hair and mud up your stockings. Joke number 1. You look less like a noble hunter and more like a shrub that lost the will to live. A quirky tidbit: some royal hunts were staged with animals practically delivered on platters. Deer were herded into enclosed areas so the monarch could take an easy shot. In some cases, servants even tied ribbons to the antlers for added spectacle. You picture this absurdity, a stag trotting around like a festive gift, and nearly laugh aloud. By afternoon, the procession resumes. Roads are lined with musicians, banners, and curious villagers. The queen waves regally, but you notice her subtle smirk when a nobleman nearly topples off his horse. Survival tip: never yawn during a royal parade. The crowd might assume you're bored with majesty itself. Historians still argue whether these progresses genuinely built loyalty or merely drained the treasury. Some accounts praise their effectiveness, Others describe them as logistical nightmares, where entire towns went bankrupt feeding the queen's retinue. You, sore and hungry, vote for nightmare. Toward evening, you're dragged into yet another show of power, a mock tournament. Courtiers joust clumsily, shields splintering, lances wobbling like broomsticks. The queen watches serenely while you pray no one skewers themselves in her honor. You're given a wooden lance just for fun, shoved into the lists, and promptly knocked onto your back by a laughing opponent. The court cheers, half in mockery, half in delight. Joke number 2. Congratulations, you've just invented the medieval banana peel gag, starring yourself. When the spectacle ends, the court sets camp in a meadow. Tents rise, fires crackle, and minstrels sing into the night. You collapse onto a pile of straw, grateful for something softer than stone floors. Around you, courtiers chatter about the day's triumphs as if none of them spent the afternoon bruising their backsides on horses. As you drift towards sleep, the banners still ripple overhead. The hounds bark in their pens, and the queen's laughter carries faintly through the night. You realize that these hunts and processions aren't about sport or travel at all. They're rituals of visibility, the monarchy moving like theater across the land, and you, aching in every muscle, are just another prop in the show. Still, under the stars, you admit it's at least more exciting than another lute solo. Dawn breaks over the makeshift camp, and before your bruises have even healed from yesterday's fun jousting accident, you're herded back onto the road. This time the procession heads not into forests or villages, but into the realm of diplomacy. Foreign envoys have arrived, and the palace has transformed itself into a stage for delicate theater. Bows, gifts, and mistranslations included. The Great Hall glitters more than usual. Tapestries have been rehung to hide damp patches on the walls, and tables groan under displays of fruit carefully polished to shine like jewels. The queen sits at the center, resplendent, every fold of her gown sending a message of power. You're squeezed into the background, instructed to smile politely but say nothing. For once, you're grateful. Words here can topple kingdoms. Mainstream fact, diplomacy in early modern courts was often ceremonial rather than practical. Negotiations happened in private letters, but the audiences, the gift exchanges, the bowing rituals were what the public saw. They projected majesty and reinforced the queen's position as equal or superior to foreign rulers. The first embassy enters. Men in brocades embroidered so heavily they might weigh more than the men themselves. They bow deeply, then attempt to rise gracefully, which proves difficult when one's hat falls off and rolls across the marble floor. You stifle a laugh. Joke number 1. Nothing says international respect like chasing your hat while dressed like a chandelier. A translator steps forward, his voice echoing through the hall, but almost immediately there's confusion. The envoy speaks rapidly, the translator hesitates, and what emerges sounds suspiciously like, "We admire the queen's goats?" You glance at the courtiers, who blink politely, while the queen smiles serenely as if goat admiration is the highest compliment imaginable. Later, you overhear a servant whisper, "The envoy meant grace." A quirky tidbit surfaces as gifts are exchanged. In some courts, the strangest tributes were presented. Live animals, exotic fruits, mechanical clocks shaped like animals that clucked or chimed. You remember reading that once. An elephant was gifted to a European monarch and paraded through the streets like a miracle. Today's offering is tamer, an ornate box of spices that makes the courtiers sneeze violently when opened. The ceremony drags on with feasting, dances, and polite conversation, so stilted it feels rehearsed. Every time a foreign noble raises his cup, courtiers scramble to mirror him, terrified of breaking some unknown etiquette. You sip wine cautiously, praying you don't trigger an international incident by picking up the wrong spoon. Historians still argue how effective these displays were. Did they genuinely foster alliances? Or were they expensive performances where both sides pretended to be impressed? Some suggest the real negotiations happened behind closed doors, while the public theater was simply a distraction. Watching the queen nod solemnly at another mistranslated speech, you lean toward the latter. The most comic moment arrives during the evening banquet. A troupe of musicians attempts to honor the visitors by playing their national melody. Unfortunately, the instruments are slightly out of tune, and what emerges sounds more like a dying goose than a national anthem. The envoys applaud politely, though you spot one of them wincing behind his goblet. Joke number 2. Diplomacy, it seems, is 40% bowing, 40% smiling, and 20% pretending your ears don't work. As the evening winds down, the envoys present their final gesture. A ceremonial bow so low one man loses his balance entirely and crashes onto the floor. Courtiers gasp, servants rush forward, and the queen, to her credit, keeps a perfectly straight face. You bite your lip to stop from laughing. Later, when you're safe in your chamber, the laughter finally bursts out, echoing against the stone walls. Still, the lesson settles heavy in your chest. Diplomacy isn't about truth or connection. It's about appearances, theater, and survival through polite lies. And in this hall of glittering masks, you've survived another day by doing the one thing you're finally good at: keeping quiet. The palace feels quieter tonight, but you know better than to trust the silence. Whispers slither through the corridors like smoke, and every glance seems sharper than usual. Today you learn the hardest lesson of all: the tempers of the Dark Queens, and what survival truly demands of you. Morning begins with a tense air. The queen enters the hall later than usual, her expression unreadable. Courtiers freeze, unsure whether to smile or bow or both at once. You follow suit, heart pounding. It's said the queen's moods dictate the rhythm of the entire day. A gentle smile, and the court blossoms with laughter. A single frown, and everyone trembles. Mainstream fact: monarchs in early modern courts cultivated mystique through unpredictability. Their tempers weren't merely personal quirks, they were political tools, keeping courtiers on edge. Fear, after all, is loyalty's strongest glue. The queen speaks little, yet her silence crackles with threat. When a noble stumbles over a compliment, she cuts him off with a raised eyebrow. The poor man pales as though he's been slapped. Later, he vanishes from the hall entirely. Sent on business. You never see him again. A quirky tidbit filters into your ears. In one court, a queen was rumored to punish mistakes by forcing courtiers to wear mismatched shoes for a week. The punishment itself was minor, but the mockery that followed was unbearable. You glance at your feet nervously, relieved both shoes match. Historians still argue whether these tales of volatile tempers were exaggerations invented by enemies, or whether queens truly wielded capricious anger like a weapon. Some describe rulers whose wrath was terrifying. Others paint them as victims of rumor. Watching the queen's eyes sweep the hall, you don't know which is true, and you don't care to find out. The afternoon drags with more ceremonies, each moment tense. A goblet is spilled, and the entire hall holds its breath. The queen's gaze lingers on the offender, then shifts away. The man exhales shakily, sweat dripping down his temple. Joke number 1. In this court, spilling wine feels like attempting regicide with grapes. As the sun sets, you find yourself reflecting on everything you've endured: the suffocating gowns, the endless banquets, the punishments, the intrigue, the cures stranger than the diseases. Each memory piles onto the next, a tower of absurdities balanced precariously. And through it all, the queen's temper looms, unseen but constant, like thunder behind clouds. By nightfall, you've learned the final lesson. Survival here isn't about wit, beauty, or even obedience. It's about silence, patience, and the art of vanishing at the right moment. You must laugh only when others laugh, speak only when invited, and above all, never ever outshine the queen. Joke number 2. In other words, your best skill is invisibility, which at least saves you from leech duty. The queen rises, dismissing the court with a flick of her hand. You bow, heart pounding, and retreat quickly. In your chamber, you collapse onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. You think perhaps you wouldn't survive a week here, but somehow, impossibly, you've lasted this long. And now, as the echoes of the palace fade, you feel the tension drain slowly from your shoulders. The torches are snuffed one by one, and the once bustling corridors fall into a hushed stillness. The clamor of the court, the rustle of gowns, the shuffle of servants, the laughter laced with menace, slips away like smoke in the night. You lie there imagining the great hall empty, the throne standing alone in the candlelight. No gossiping courtiers, no punishments disguised as jokes, no endless lutes strumming in minor keys. Just the quiet hum of stone walls and the faint chirp of crickets outside. Breathe in deeply. Feel the air fill your chest, then release it, slow and steady. Each breath carries you further away from the queen's sharp gaze, further away from the anxieties of the day. You're safe now, not a pawn in her intrigues, not a player in her games. The gowns, the wigs, the ceremonies, they all dissolve into mist. What remains is the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the softness of your pillow, the calm weight of stillness settling over you. Imagine the palace shrinking into the distance, its spires fading into the horizon. Imagine yourself walking away down a quiet lane, free from bells and bows and punishments. The air is cool, the night is calm, and each step brings more peace. The lessons of survival, the silence, the patience, the invisibility, melt away too, because here in this moment, you no longer need them. Here you can simply rest. Let the story close, like a heavy book gently shut. Let your eyes grow heavier with each breath until they slip closed entirely. Sleep is waiting, soft and forgiving, ready to carry you where no queen's temper can follow.